Alrighty. Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah Sistisla, and I am the CEO of Arm Hug Podcasts. And I am here with David Wachowski, the CTO of Trusted Nurse Staffing. And he is going to give us some insight of some things that he knows that many of you nurses might not know. So he's going to lay down some secrets. So, David, would you like to get us started, though, a little bit about you?
Yeah. We'll pull back the curtain on myself first and then the travel nurse staffing industry.
Yeah.
I'm from Buffalo, New York.
Mm.
After college, I moved away and went to Chicago, and then I moved back to Buffalo, and then I moved to London, and then I moved back to Buffalo, and then I moved to New York City, and then I moved back to Buffalo. And so I'm here for good. And when I got back to Buffalo the last time, I had a remote position at a startup, and we ended up going out of business. And so I was looking for something new, and this job popped up to lead a travel nurse staffing company with technology and help the company out. So I applied and got the job.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting how like you don't have the healthcare nursing, like you don't have to be a nurse to get into tech. You're into tech because you probably love helping nurses.
I've worked in a lot of different industries. So
Mhm.
that when I first got out of college, I was doing video games for a while, which was really
Wow.
fun. I worked on government software after that, like helping utilities read meters and do their finances for small towns and cities. And I worked then for a big data startup measuring social media, worked in a little bit of advertising, mortgages and loans for commercial real estate. And now I'm into nurses and helping helping nurses with their assignments, helping getting them placed, and then you know, anything else kind of like internally tools that we need around the
That's
company.
awesome. Yeah, no, that's great. And so speaking of the nursing, so I'll start off with our first question. What's the difference between the travel nurse platforms and why would a nurse use one over another?
Yeah, so so full disclosure, we are a travel nurse staffing company, right? So there's kind of a wide spectrum of different companies that work in this space and a lot of competitors. There's tons and tons of competitors. So even just in the Buffalo area, there might be 20 different agencies that are
Wow.
doing what we're doing, of varying sizes, right? And kind of what it boils down to is there's kind of the traditional agency, and what you would think of as this is a few people or a bunch of people working in an office. They're calling nurses, finding nurses. So that's that side, and then they're calling hospitals and getting contracts with hospitals, and they're making a connection. And they're saying, okay, well, this nurse is going to work at this facility, and here's the contracts, 13 weeks. This is what the stipends are going to be, which are, I can get into that a little bit later. But this is your pay package, and both sides are happy. You're a matchmaker, you're a recruiter. And
Yes.
that kind of works in any industry, right? If I wanted to get a tech job, I can go to a recruiter and call that person, and they would link me to a company that they work with and get me a pay package and advocate for me. So that's the agency side. And it can be tech enabled. They might have Salesforce or a CRM system that keeps track of nurses' names and their credentials and a bunch of other information about it. But they might not have a public job board, for example. So
Right.
what jobs are available, they might not have that. On a very far other end of the spectrum, I'd say probably within the last 5 years, there's been at least a few, if not a bunch of companies that have sprung up kind of like out of the Silicon Valley technology side that build themselves as platforms. And one of the buzz terms in that space is recruiterless. So rather than a recruiter whose specific job is to like talk to a nurse, talk to a facility, make that connection, they're trying to solve that with technology. Like,
Mm.
okay, well, why don't we get 10,000 jobs into our platform? You give us your data. We have a bunch of data, and we're going to make those connections automatically.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know some people, now that you mention it, that have started companies in that space, and now it's starting to make sense. So it's like a customer service. It's a bit more like AI oriented kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah, so it's all algorithm based, like TikTok
Wow.
will feed you the videos that you end up liking. And the idea of these platforms is they'll feed you the jobs that you're most likely to pick, automate a lot of your pay package stuff. And the difference there is that you're talking a lot less to a human being,
Right.
but typically there's more kind of like data around it and algorithms and tech. So those companies, for example, tend to hire a lot of tech people and not a lot of recruiters. On the other side, you're hiring a lot of recruiters and not a lot of tech people. And then in between that, there's a whole wide spectrum. So we're kind of like, we sit in the middle of that a little bit. We have a tech team, we have tech products, we have a job board that is posted on a website where a nurse can log in, they can add their credentials, they can look at jobs throughout the country, see what pay packages could be and stuff. But on the other end, they're always talking to a recruiter if they want a job.
Right. So it's a bit more
So
hybrid.
yeah, it's a hybrid model. There's varying pros and cons to all of these things, right? So on the one side, if you're going to a platform, they tend to actually pay more as well because you don't have to basically pay a recruiter to do any of that work. You're trying to find efficiencies with technology and AI and all that. So they tend to like spend a lot of money on marketing to try to find people. They might pay more nurses more, but they don't have as much of a human connection. On the other end of the spectrum, you have agencies which have a huge human connection. You're always talking to someone, but they might not have some of the algorithms and data that would help you, or maybe the reach of the specific number of jobs that might be available to a nurse.
Mm.
So yeah, we're in the middle trying to basically do both of them to some extent, right? Like keep a human connection, but provide data to both recruiters and to nurses to help them with their journey.
Makes sense. And then you talked about this a little bit, but why would different recruiting companies advertise different pay packages for the exact same job?
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into basically pay packages and like the whole situation, and it differs in different states and different areas. But like maybe I can just lay out kind of the cost structure and like where money comes from and where it goes. So like at the very top, there's a facility, and a facility wants to hire a nurse. Typically, they're hiring travel nurses because they either can't find enough staff nurses to fill their slots, or they have like their workforce expands during flu season and then contracts during the summer. So they need like kind of a temporary workforce for specific periods of time.
Makes sense.
So the facility says, I'm going to pay X amount per hour for a nurse. Then you kind of split up into two different types. Some facilities will actually have a HR team that's dedicated to hiring travel nurses. And so we work with some of those facilities, and we might have a nurse, Susan Sue, and we call the facility and we place them. Or maybe they don't work with agencies at all and they only work direct with nurses, in which case you might be talking to a hospital and you're like, okay, yeah, I want a temporary assignment, and they don't get agencies involved at all. What typically happens though, and what we've seen a lot, is the facility won't do any of the direct hiring themselves. They might do interviews, but they won't be managing the process of hiring and interviewing and all the payroll and spreadsheets and stuff like that. They hire what's called an MSP, and that stands for managed service provider. Doesn't really matter, but it's basically a company that handles all of the logistics of getting and staffing a travel nurse and getting them paid and all of the people happy.
Right.
And they typically take a cut. Like every single person, middleman, middle company you have in any of these things takes their cut. So facility is going to pay some amount per hour, MSP gets a cut. Then there's typically agencies then that work with that MSP. So you have one MSP and it's providing 20 jobs at a hospital or 100 jobs or one job, it doesn't really matter. And there's us, Trusted Nurse Staffing, and 50 competitors or more, all with access to this job or two. And we're going to try to find the nurses and staff them. So we're all submitting nurses to them. And then they're getting interviewed and then they get placed. So we take our cut as well. So essentially, there's like this top rate, MSP takes their cut, and then the trusted nurse staffing or competitor also takes a cut because we have to pay people to do work, right? So we're doing a lot of credentialing, we're paying for upfront skills assessments and helping our nurses and paying recruiters commission on things that they place. So yeah, all that overhead helps us keep us in business and a nice office, for us to work out of as well.
How long does it take from when the job is open to when it's closed?
The quickest ones are under 24 hours.
Wow.
The the longer ones can be months. It really depends. Typically, we see it depends on the market. So some areas are just way more competitive than other ones. So kind of what I was talking about before, there's certain areas that are hotbeds for travel nurse activity, and they're like competition areas. So a company might be willing to pay nurses more in an area because of a strategic reason. Maybe the company is saying, we want to move into, Buffalo, New York. So we're going to offer the best rates in Buffalo, New York. And we're going to try to capture as many of those jobs and as many of the nurses as possible until we form a large base. And then we have more leverage and more power to negotiate with things. And maybe we'll lower our rates for our nurses after, a year because we've captured the market and we have that kind of control. So like part of the offering different rates at different areas is what are you willing to even take a loss on, right? Like remember when Netflix or some of these companies would just like offer rock bottom rates, similar to like if you get internet, right? I know like internet is $40 a month for super high speed internet, and then you have it for a year and they raise it to $140.
Right.
And you're like, they're just trying to get customers up front, and then down the line they hit you with a bigger sticker price because they've already captured you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I feel like you could teach a class in this. This is so interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and like how the company positions themselves. Like every company has certain values and a certain mission and a certain culture. So like we specifically try to embrace transparency. So upfront, we don't list the highest paying jobs. Like our jobs are not against our competitors. We're not paying the most. But part of that is upfront, we're telling you exactly what you're going to get paid. Some other companies might advertise really high rates, but by the time you get to your pay package, it's like, oh, insurance and this fee, and all of a sudden, oh, it's lower. So trying to be upfront versus, it's always kind of a question from a marketing strategy, like what do you try to do? Do you try to like hook people in and then like bait and switch it, or do you try to be transparent up front? What are the values of you as a company? Because if people don't feel good throughout the entire process, maybe they'll stay with you for one assignment, but maybe they leave after that.
You mentioned MSP. Can you talk a little bit about what that is for people who might not know that are listening?
Yeah, so an MSP, a managed service provider, that term is used in a lot of different industries, but in this specific area, like we have an MSP. So we work with a facility and we help them staff their travel nurses. So we will handle all of the interactions with companies like Trusted Nurse Staffing. We will handle all of the submissions that people put in. We will help make sure that all the nurses are compliant and that everyone who walks through the door has been vetted. They're going to get paid. They're a real nurse. They're a real person. All the stuff and work that kind of goes into it. And then, so we're also working with the facility to help them too. So the MSP can take feedback. So they can get feedback from staffing firms, they can get feedback from nurses, from the facilities themselves, and they help become a little bit of a liaison. So we have programs, for example, where we bring in management training. And we say, okay, well, all your nurses here are complaining that managers, don't let me take breaks, or they don't know how to do performance reviews or something like that. And so we can bring in management training or help them with their finances and help kind of be that bridge between nurses and the facility to make it a better work environment.
Yeah, that's awesome that you guys have access to it. Like you can see that.
Yeah, it's great. Having the MSPs really kind of control a lot of it because they control what jobs are available. So it's really useful for a company to have one of these and have a large one, because if, for example, a competitor of ours controls an entire market and they're the provider of all the jobs, they have a lot of leverage to just be like, oh, well, we're not going to pay much for these, or we're going to pay our own internal agency more, our own internal nurses more than some competitors. And so you kind of get into like monopoly considerations on, okay, well, you control the supply and the demand, and
Right.
like, do you actually have too much control over here? And it gets really interesting.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about tech, cybersecurity wise. Anything that nurses should watch out for when looking into these platforms? How do you know if there's some that maybe are bad actors or maybe just trying to take your information?
Yeah. I mean, I would assume that anything you put your data into is like getting sold by someone. We're not selling data, but I've just basically anything I sign up for, I
Yeah.
just assume like there goes my data. But yeah, I think you can kind of tell when something's shady just by how it looks and whether it looks like it's from 1995 or modern. And, in general, well, there's a lot of tools out there too. So for example, ChatGPT is something that a lot of people have been using for things. And I love ChatGPT,
Yep.
but you have to be careful about your data with that as well, unless you have a paid version and you've kind of like checked the box where you're not going to send training data. Everything you put in there is potentially going to surface to someone else. So, for example, if you're working on your resume as a nurse and you want to submit it to somewhere and you want to make sure that, you want to flesh it out a little bit, you have like 2 bullet points and you're like, can I make this 3 bullet points or 4? Can I reword this a little bit better? I wouldn't necessarily just copy paste your entire resume with your name into ChatGPT, for example. You want to be like very deliberate about like, okay, you be very generic and you say, can you write me a resume blurb for an OR nurse who has worked in 5 facilities and, these are the types of tasks that they did. And then let it write it very generically versus actually pasting any of your own personal information in.
Yeah, it's a good tip.
Data is super valuable.
A reminder.
And every company is trying to get it. Like I'm a data person, so I love being able to use data in interesting ways. So like we see 3,000 jobs come through every couple of weeks through our system. So, some of them are closed within 24 hours, some of them are open for multiple months, but in general, it's a very high volume of jobs. So what's really cool from a data perspective is we can provide analytics to our recruiters to actually help them understand what jobs are paying the most within certain areas, what jobs are closing quickly, what are moving, what facilities do we have really good traction for. So like part of what a recruiter does is a nurse could be interested in 100 jobs, but we know exactly which specific facilities or MSPs or any of these companies are actually moving quickly. So we've had a lot of traction with this one. So I'm going to submit you to these 3 because I know I can get you an offer within 2 days or 3 days. And we have success with those things. And so taking all that data and visualizing it gives our recruiters kind of a leg up in how they can place people. And I'm sure other companies are doing something very similar on their side. But then we can also turn around and give that data to nurses too. So just like we have, for example, in our Pronto job board, when a nurse looks at any given job, we list out different things you can do in that city, for example. Like, oh, you're in Buffalo, you're an outdoor person. You can hike the Niagara Falls Gorge. You can go to Delaware Park and float around on swans. Or if you like food, here's the 5 different food places that are great in Buffalo. There's tons of them here, but just giving data
Yeah.
where it's available to people to just empower their conversations, like push them into a new place, a new level quicker.
How do you incorporate the nurses' feedback on your platforms?
Yeah, so some of it is surveys. For any nurse that we place, for example, that becomes an employee of ours, we send out multiple surveys, kind of just gauging how their assignments were, what they think of their recruiters. We could start asking questions about tech. We used to have a feedback button on the website that was like one of those annoying pop-up things, and no one ever clicked it, so we took it off. And I was like, can we just get rid of this thing? And then we run user groups. So we'll take nurses that our recruiters are working with, we'll bring them into the office, give them like a Tim Hortons gift card, and then ask them feedback and questions like, what do you think about this feature? If we provided more pay transparency around insurance options, would you find that useful, or is this too busy? You tell me.
That's
So it's
such a
kind of
good
like
idea.
that focus group. Do you like the Oreo cookie this way or that way type of conversations?
Yeah, because I feel like sometimes when even the buttons are on the website, they have feedback. They just don't want to, they're like, I don't want to click and then I don't have to write it. But that's funny that you're like, well, we'll give you a treat. Come on
Yeah, I mean,
over.
everything on a website is competing for attention,
Right.
right? So you have like pay packages that are competing for attention on an apply button or your profile. We want you to complete your profile so that we can get you submitted quicker. That's competing for attention. So we have to be really careful from a product development perspective on what we're putting on there, how we're putting it on, because if you put a little asterisk and say this includes your insurance options, and someone won't read it, right? They'll forget, or they won't see it because of all the things going on, and you start to create discrepancies with what people think your product is doing or not doing. And so we're very careful about our products and trying to like be deliberate about how we add visual elements to it.
Yeah, that's a really good tip also for people who are running their own websites. That when you put things out there, sometimes when you add tons of buttons, people won't know which to click and they'll ignore it.
Yeah. And like marketing wants tons of data about the leads they're bringing in, but that means we have to add things to forms. So when you sign up and you have like 16 questions, that's usually a marketing team that's like, hey, we need these 16 things answered. And then the tech team is like, yeah, but that's going to, less people are going to register for your website because you have 16 things. Can we bring it down to 3 things? And then you meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. And then I really like this question because I get a lot of questions about travel jobs. So how far away does a facility need to be considered a travel job? Am I reading
Yeah,
that?
it's interesting. So a lot of our nurses, because we have a lot of contracts in the Western New York area. So a lot of nurses from Buffalo will travel to Rochester, and a lot of nurses from Rochester will travel to Buffalo. And this gets into the kind of stipends thing that I mentioned earlier. If you're duplicating expenses somewhere else, you can
Oh,
get tax-free housing and meal stipends. So essentially, it's kind of like extra. A lot of travel nurses consider extra pay, but you're supposed to be renting a hotel room and paying for meals in that other city with that money. The general rule is 50 miles. So if you're traveling at least 50 miles, then like tax authorities and stuff will consider you probably duplicating your expenses. But the general rule is you have to be at least, or not the 50 miles, you have to be duplicating your expenses to get stipends. Now, you could take a travel job in the exact same city that you work at a lot of places, but you just won't get that extra bump in pay. So you'll be taking like basically just the taxable wages and not any of the tax-free stipend stuff into your pay package.
that makes sense.
Some facilities don't hire people locally. And so they're trying to fill staff positions. And so they're thinking to themselves, why would we hire local people for this temporary position? We'll only take outsiders. If you work or live locally, we want to hire you permanently. So their general gist is they don't want to make their local staff nurses sad. by hiring other local people at higher rates than them. Because travel nurses get paid a lot more than staff nurses typically.
So would you say there's a higher demand for travel nurses, or I guess that depends on the location?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a nursing shortage for various reasons. I don't know clearly all the details on why, but I know a lot of nurses have left the industry. There's maybe not as many coming in, and especially like burnout around COVID and stuff. So there's been a general exodus. So demand is still really high for nurses in a lot of areas. I'm sure a lot of them are placing staff nurses as well as travel nurses. We don't do a lot of this. We don't do much of the permanent placement. So I don't have a lot to say about that industry just because I'm not in it day to day.
Okay. Thank you so much. I feel like this has been awesome. I do have one last question. So we talked about searching on job boards. What are some of the green flags? Because I know we talked a lot about the red flags.
Yeah. So like what if I was a travel nurse, what would I be looking for when I looked at a platform?
Right.
Probably so getting a feel for what the company values are. So understanding like what is the culture of this place, right? And when you're starting to think about a spectrum of agency to platform, recognizing which one it is. So you're going in there, and are they pitching themselves as recruiter lists? Do they have recruiters? Are you going to talk to a person? Looking up reviews on Google or Glassdoor or any other place where you can actually get other nurse testimonials for what that place is likely to work, like how it will be to work with them, is all really good information as well. So trying to figure out like where they sit in the spectrum. It's not necessarily a green flag or a red flag. It's just you want to know what you're getting into when you're doing it, right? And then I think transparency. So, are pay packages clear? Do you understand, if you talk to another nurse, is the pay package that they're being offered similar to what being shown on the website? Or are there discrepancies between the website and what you end up getting? Typically with most companies, there is some negotiation room with things. So it might not be exact to the dollar and cents, or sometimes, different insurance options change things. But in general, I would look for something that looks fairly modern. If you want to talk to a recruiter, which there's a lot of benefits to it, trying to find someone who's either hybrid or full agency is useful. If you don't care and you're seasoned, maybe like a platform is right for you. Trying to get a couple $100 extra a week, and you don't need to talk to someone. You're super seasoned. You know exactly what you're getting into. Maybe it works better to go to that platform model. So I think there's probably something that's right for any given nurse where they are in their career.
Yeah. There's a lot of flexibility, it sounds.
Yes. Some companies also have their credentialing teams and all the people, like there's a lot of work to get someone in the door at a facility, a lot of credentials, certificates, etc. And some companies have that in-house and some companies outsource that. So it's kind of hard to find that out up front, but if you talk to other nurses that work with them, you start to understand like, okay, well, if there's a credentialing question or an issue and it takes 24 hours or 48 hours typically to resolve, it might be because they're outsourcing that to India or some other foreign country. And there's a time delay between when things get submitted. I can walk upstairs to my credentialing team and talk to them anytime, but other companies might not have that luxury. So I think word of mouth is probably one of the better ways if you have some nursing friends who are traveling. I think every nurse that we've talked to has logins to like 5 different platforms or so, and they can start to like compare rates and all that stuff.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's interesting too, though. It's like, okay, so then they could compare and then negotiate. It's really interesting. It's grown so much in this direction where it's giving people more flexibility, which will be better for the industry. We'll see more people trying to come in here, maybe learn how to use it. But I guess the reason why I wanted to have you on was to actually let people know that this exists.
Yeah, it's not just nursing. I keep saying the word nurse, but allied workers as well can travel. So like respiratory therapists and phlebotomists and whatnot. We personally have jobs in those things. I know other agencies do as well.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank you, David. This is awesome. Yeah, I think
Yeah,
people were really helpful. It's good to hear about other platforms that are out there and that are doing this because there's so many questions about it. And I'm always thinking, like, I'm sure someone's working on this. It's just nobody has just sat down with people to explain, like, hey, maybe you should try this. Or so thank you so much for going
yeah.
through
It
that.
always surprises me, like, because I worked in a lot of industries, how many marketplaces are just set up around all of these, different things, like travel nursing. Like, who would have thought? Okay, temporary assignments. Here's all these different players and MSPs and see it, all these different companies that are all like doing things that revolve around this very specific type of work. It's cool.
Yeah, it's cool. It's fun. It's fun talking about it.